Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the NK News podcast. This week, we're looking at North Korea's deepening ties with China and Russia, from a new round of high-level diplomacy with Beijing to the murky networks behind Pyongyang's expanding trade and labour links with Moscow. Later, I'll speak with retired US diplomat Susan Thornton about fire and fury, Trump-Kim diplomacy, and what Washington should do now as North Korea grows closer to both China and Russia. But first, I'm joined now in the studio on Tuesday, July 14th with NK News Data Correspondent Anton Sokolin. Welcome back to the podcast, Anton.
Hello, and hey, listeners.
So we're going to start today by looking at the latest burst of diplomacy between Beijing and Pyongyang, after North Korean Premier Pak Thae Song met Chinese President Xi Jinping during a visit marking the 65th anniversary of the China-DPRK alliance treaty. That visit's now being followed by another major exchange with Wang Huning, one of China's top political figures, and Xi's veteran ideological strategist, set to travel to North Korea this week. Pak's visit was already notable because visits by North Korean premiers to China, they're relatively rare.
Right.
Anton, first, what did this meeting with Xi tell us about where China-North Korea ties are standing right now?
Right. It's good that you noted that it's very rare. Indeed, there has not been many reports on previous visits at all. The previous one, the latest one, I think dates back to 2018. It was by Park Bong-ju back then. And before that, it was even earlier. So also about 7 years before that. So it is indeed rare, and it marks a very important milestone in the bilateral relationship. Speaking of Park's meeting with Xi Jinping, well, there is, of course, not much coming out of their official readouts, right? It's all about ideology, it's all about friendship, but several things are important. They stood out. For example, of course, their military alliance pact is at the center of their talks. Both leaders, when they met in May, agreed to hold joint ceremonies to celebrate the event, the signing of the treaty. And of course, at this time, this visit kind of came as a follow-up to Xi Jinping's visit to Pyongyang. So the two officials, Xi Jinping and Pak Thae Song, they focused on deepening practical cooperation, voicing stronger support for each other, etc. Of course, highlighting revolutionary and historical ties, because that is kind of central to the two countries' relationship, to their ideological ties. And of course, another thing was that Kim instructed Pak Thae Song apparently to deepen and develop the strongest strategic relationship with China and convey this message to Xi Jinping. And it's hard to overlook another aspect, of course, the Taiwan issue. According to the Chinese state media readout, Pak Thae Song conveyed North Korea's position that it supports China's one China policy. Mm-hmm. Meaning that Taiwan is an integral part of the of China. So that was that. There were no specific economic initiatives announced. There was no specific talks about the joint projects, because, as we know, this chunk of the kind of the bilateral agenda was discussed before during the Xi-Kim summit in May, when they discussed all the economic exchanges, all the human-to-human exchanges. I don't know, law enforcement, military ties. Xi Jinping brought a gigantic delegation featuring all major political and economic and military figures. Mm-hmm. So that was done back then. Now this visit came as just a follow-up, an update, but it's still important because it's rare, because they're focusing on their historical ties, because they are ramping up their meetings, their exchanges. It's been a while since we've seen such a slew of bilateral meetings, and now we're coming to Wang Huning, right? So another visit just less than a week after Pak Thae Song traveled to China. So.
Yeah, so Anton, you just mentioned Wang Huning. Today, as I said, we're recording, it's Tuesday, July 14th, and you've literally just covered about this news that Wang Huning is going to Pyongyang. How significant is it that China is sending someone of his rank and his political profile?
Right. Wang Huning is one of the most prominent politicians on the Chinese political arena stage. He's been around for very long. He's also not a very young man. We can rightly call him a veteran politician in
It's a
the
polite
Chinese.
way to put it.
Yeah, a veteran politician in the Chinese system who is basically a philosopher, is an academic, is a scholar of the communist thought, of the communist ideology, who studied deeply the teachings of Karl Marx, whatever Lenin, and but he came to prominence when he basically started advising and steering the ideological doctrines of major Chinese leaders, starting with Jiang Zemin. So that goes back to the 90s. Then we have Hu Jintao, early 2000s, and of course, the latest example is Xi Jinping. So, as far as I understand, I'm not a China expert, so whoever's listening, feel free to correct us, and we will take note of that. The point I'm trying to make is that he was behind major doctrinal and ideological shifts that happened within the Chinese Communist Party. And when it comes to Xi Jinping, the main thing was, Xi Jinping is known worldwide for his China's dream. And that is his kind of cornerstone of his political ideology, especially in the early days. And Wang is assessed to have left certain imprint on that. So he is not just a random guy. He is definitely very well integrated into the Chinese communist hierarchy. He's very close to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping trusts him because, well, I can't really confirm, and nobody probably can really say it, but it seems like he is really behind these doctrinal ideas, and he has at least his actions, or at least his instructions, informed what Xi Jinping's ideology came out to be later. So that is important. And now we're seeing him going to Pyongyang, and of course that raises an important question of what he's going to do there. But knowing his background, even though the readouts from Xinhua or from KCNA, they didn't really tell us the story of what they're going to discuss, but we can understand that it comes around the right after the 65th anniversary of the signing of the military pact agreement. Then they have this slew of meetings, and ideology probably is going to take center stage because that is something that brings them together, because their historical ties, the revolutionary, especially their revolutionary ties. We know about multiple North Korean military and future officials that participated, that were active in China during the revolutionary period, and then of course the Chinese support during the Korean War. So all of this, it is those blood-forged bonds that they don't go away easily, and probably they're going to be again at the center of this visit's agenda. But of course, we're still waiting to see some more readouts to cover it, and it will be interesting. But I do not think that we should get our hopes up. Probably it's going to be quite boring, actually.
Okay. Well, that was going to be my next question. I don't want to speculate too much because neither Chinese state media nor North Korean state media has said what is going to be on the agenda. But as we've touched on, this is coming on the heels of that meeting between Xi and Kim Jong-un, which, as you explained, Anton, during that summit, they discussed economic, military, law enforcement, humanitarian cooperation. If we are going to speculate just for a minute, what kind of areas do you think might be the main priority in terms of cooperation that Beijing and Pyongyang might discuss in talks coming up?
Well, Wang, I'm not sure that closer ideological alignment probably, but that would entail a whole other array of questions pertaining to how what exactly, because we know that ideologically North Korea and China, even though we kind of collectively put them in this communist basket, they're actually different. But at the same time, we're seeing stronger push within the Pyongyang system towards this China model, right? So a bit of more capitalism, a bit of more economic exchanges. So it's not opening to the outside world like China did, but it is allowing certain room. So Kim Jong-un has witnessed how his country was very poor, and to transform it, he clearly sees that there is not much there's not much room for super strict government control. Of course, the government continues to hold reins of power, but to allow certain economic freedoms within certain limited kind of environment, that is something that they're trying to pursue. Maybe it could be related to this, to understand how China managed to do it and how it could be implemented in North Korea, but which is already being kind of the case. But well, we're talking about a very relatively poor country, so to scale this, they need some input, and maybe China can provide it. But another thing, probably, which has been in the talks for a while now, is of course human-to-human exchanges. And when they talk about it, it's an euphemism for tourism, right? Tourism or business ties. We know that some Chinese businessmen go into North Korea pretty regularly, but does that mean that they are ramping up their business ties? Yes and no, because we are not seeing official business deals. Everything is kind of like a hush-hush. So if we see more, that will be an indicator that, oh, indeed, they are building stronger commercial ties, stronger business ties. At the same time, even though there is no such not so many visits like this, we are seeing that the trade is on the rise. And of course, Colin, our colleague, covered multiple smuggling operations that are happening alongside the border. So there's clearly some interest on both sides in maintaining this momentum and this relationship. But I'm not sure this economic, particularly this technicality aspect, is going to be central to Wang's talks, because he's more of an ideology, more of like a big picture guy. So we should expect something in that kind of domain. I would say that.
Well, he's going to be in Pyongyang from Wednesday to Friday this week. So, of course, we'll be following closely to see what does come out of his time in North Korea. And we'll turn now to Russia's growing demand for North Korean workers and why one Russian mayor says his city simply can't afford them. Anton, the mayor of Orenburg, recently said he tried to hire North Korean street cleaners, but that the plans fell through because the costs were just too high. First of all, tell us, what exactly was he trying to do, and why did the deal not work out?
Right. So it is important to explain a bit of context what's going on right in Russia. Because of the war, because of the special military operation, Russia has been experiencing labor shortages. So that is something that is hurting the economy, because Russia has recently reported it's had the historical low, the unemployment was at its historical low. So, of course, every man is busy being at the front lines, right? Occupied there. So there's a shortage, right? But housing has to be built, streets need to be cleaned. And for years, for decades, Russia has relied on Central Asian migrants, but Russia has recently kind of ratcheted up the pressure on these immigration flows on the back of its far-right ideology that is trying to limit the migrant inflows from Central Asia. Citing multiple factors, it's not really pertinent to our case, but the point is Russia is trying to limit that sort of migration and is looking for ways to diversify labor inflows. And Russia is not only looking up to North Korea, there is multiple other countries, there is India, there is even Afghanistan. They're making a deal with the Taliban to procure Afghani workers from Bangladesh, from Vietnam, from China. Used to be really big. Before they got rich, they were all over Sakhalin instead of North Koreans, my birthplace. It was all Chinese workers before the North Koreans took their spot. So there's been there. And this mayor in Orenburg, it's a city north of Kazakhstan. So if you are familiar with the geography, Kazakhstan, press up north, there's steppes, and there's pretty much nothing there. And it's a city, a frontier city for Russia. So he's been looking for workers because he needs communal services, and they are not being probably carried out very well. So he turned to several suppliers, he talked to a few people, and what apparently the North Korean middleman told him that like the prices are just outrageously high, the costs, right, to procure one North Korean worker. But he referred, when he was saying that, he referred to this thing as if. It's not because the cost of procuring North Korean laborers is high. It's because the North Koreans themselves in North Korea make so much that they won't even lift their finger to go to Russia for these peanuts that he's offering there. And of course, that was a little misleading there because, well, he announced that they're making probably something like around 1,700 or to $2,100, $2,200 per month. Well, that is extremely huge salary for North Korea. And we know from experts that no, the North Koreans do not, regular workers, street cleaners, or construction workers, they do not make even close to that, even half of that. No. This is the salaries that are common within the IT industry, illegal North Korean IT workers, maybe some officials, maybe someone who is an entrepreneur but with business, with ties to the government. That is maybe possible, but even that is a little bit exaggerated. So we should be cautious. So then what was he referring to? And that is a more interesting question, because if we break it down, how this procurement system works, we understand that, the cost that he named is exactly what has been circulating around, and we also confirmed it independently, that this is the cost that is involved in the procurement of North Korean laborers. So it means that you need to sponsor their visas, you need to sponsor their insurance, you need to sponsor all overhead kind of costs, right? If airfare as well, right? And of course, you need to pay certain kickbacks for the Russian middleman. When I say visa, it's also an interesting case, because we know that North Korean workers are processed as students in Russia, and they are usually processed by this particular college, and this college has multiple branches around the country, and in order to bypass international sanctions, because North Koreans are banned from earning income abroad, right? So it involves multiple costs, and that actually brings the total price higher, and it's not really relevant to how much the North Koreans make inside North Korea. It's actually just about the middlemen that name their price. They say, look, here's our North Korean workers, per person you have to sponsor this and that. That adds up to this price. If you're willing to pay it, we can supply this many men.
Well, let's stick with the Russia connection for our last topic and talk about a court case that starts with a failed corn shipment to North Korea, but ends up revealing much more about Pyongyang's sanctions evasion network. Before we get into the details, let's start with the basic story. Anton, what was supposed to happen in this corn deal and what went wrong?
Right. A few years ago, basically, a Russian man in the Far East was approached by North Koreans through their diplomats stationed there, because I think over there they have a consular section, and one of the diplomats working for the economic department approached this man saying, well, look, we need to get some corn. And can you supply this much corn, right? So they say they wanted to get 5,000 tons, for example, but as a first shipment, right? But the total amount was supposed to be much bigger, and as the first batch is 5,000 tons, can you do that? He's like, all right, sure. Give me an advance payment. So they gave them some money. And the guy was like, all right, I will start shipping this corn. And then he started like coming up with these excuses, right? Like, I don't know, like a sanctions situation is very difficult, and customs procedures are too complicated, or the government is levying new customs fees. So basically I sent you this much, and you have to cover some additional costs. And the North Koreans were like, what's going on? Hang on. We already gave you like half the money So you undersupplied by now. So well, either give us the money back or the deal is off. So and eventually, basically, the North Koreans took that case to court, and the court sided with the North Koreans. But the catch here is not just corn. Who cares about corn? Corn is it's central, but at the same time, it's tangential to the situation, because at the center of this operation was an actually Mongolian firm that the North Koreans tasked with processing payments on behalf of the real North Korean company based in North Korea that wanted to get that corn, right? Because apparently this North Korean company couldn't wire money directly to the Russians, so they had to enlist the services of this Mongolian firm. The Mongolian firm, in its turn, is run by a former South Korean citizen and is actually a South Korea sanctioned company. The individual running this, the former South Korean national, is also under sole sanctions, exactly for the thing that they were doing, for processing payments on behalf of the North Korean regime and companies, whatever. So it was functioned as your typical front company for North Korea. And despite that fact that this company was involved in it, the court completely overlooked it. It sided with the Mongolian sided with the Mongolian firm that acted as a proxy for the North Korean companies. So technically siding with the North Koreans and the North Korean diplomats who represented them in court and etc. So this basically little corn debacle just exposed how this sanctions operation, how the sanctions evasion operations work, how the North Koreans utilize foreign companies, how they rely on a whole bunch of networks, that how they can even entice former South Korean citizens to participate in these kind of schemes. And imagine that's just corn. Imagine how many other deals there could be that we just are not even aware of.
Well, Anton, you've just touched on the fact that this particular court case, it focused on the fraud and it didn't really deal with the sanctions evasion side of this corn transaction. Is that surprising? Like, what does it tell us about how Russia is handling these North Korea linked cases?
Right. So it was early on. It was still early in the partnership when the deal was supposed to happen, right? But just the court case was settled only recently, only a few months ago. And I'm sure there could be some further hearings. I'm not entirely sure, but there could be some appellate court hearings, whatever. So it happened early on. And at that time, it was kind of new. Both countries were coming out of the pandemic, so it was new. The businessmen tried to figure out approaches how to cooperate with one another. But again, the case demonstrated that diplomats, North Korean diplomats stationed in Russia, they had access all along to business networks, to companies. They meet with all kinds of people. And but this case, even though it's illustrative of this little scandal that happened between them, it's also kind of symptomatic, because even though it wasn't early on in the partnership, we are seeing other cases similar to this, where they just demonstrate that the North Koreans and Russians do not really trust each other and are reaping the benefits whenever they can, basically robbing each other, scamming each other whenever it's possible. So it's a very it's a very young partnership, and it just shows how vulnerable it is to individuals with malicious intents, and how just a Russian minor businessman or a North Korean entrepreneurs, they're ready to line their pockets whenever there is an opportunity presents itself.
Well, big picture, ultimately, what should we be taking away from this case? Is it just kind of a strange one-off scam, or does it tell us something, about more broad about how Russia DPRK trade is expanding, and as you've touched on already, how messy, how informal, and how really risky it can be?
It's just one of many cases. There is definitely many more. We have seen others. It's either the North Koreans are suing the Russians, or the Russians suing North Koreans. It is interesting because at this point, North Korea is entering this formal relations with the Russian authorities. So just think about it. North Korea is under tons of sanctions. Has it ever appealed any kind of sanctions move by the U.S., for instance? Has it ever actually even entered litigations in the US, for instance. No, it hasn't ever. Well, maybe there were some cases I'm not aware of, but thing is, in Russia, they are becoming an active subject of this business relations. They are actually part of business deals, and they know how to represent themselves. They know who to hire to conduct these court hearings, how to interact with different actors. So it's just showing that the relationship is evolving, it's maturing, but at the same time, it's still early to call it a properly mature partnership. For now, it's very transactional and very based on tangible benefits. Whoever can get them, well, they win.
Well, that's all we have time for today. But if you want more details on the stories we've discussed, make sure to check them out on NK News and NK Pro, and I'll have them all linked in the show notes of this episode. Anton Sokolin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And after the break, we'll shift to US policy and speak with retired senior diplomat Susan Thornton about fire and fury, Trump-Kim diplomacy, and what Washington should do now. So stay tuned for that. I'm now joined by Susan Thornton, a retired senior US diplomat who spent nearly 3 decades at the State Department, including as acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. She's now a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, Director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Susan had a front-row seat to one of the most dramatic shifts in recent US-North Korea relations, from the fire and fury tensions of 2017 to the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore. She's also worked extensively on China, Korea, and broader Asia-Pacific security issues. And today we're going to talk about how dangerous 2017 really felt from inside government, what the summit diplomacy got right and what it got wrong, and what Washington should do now as North Korea expands its nuclear arsenal and moves closer to China and Russia. Susan Thornton, thank you so much for joining us from New York today.
Thank you so much. So great to be with you, Alana.
So, Susan, you were serving during one of the most intense and unpredictable periods in recent US-North Korea relations, from fire and fury to the opening of direct summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. When you look back at that period now, what stands out to you the most?
I guess what stands out to me the most is how volatile and unpredictable that period really was, and in many ways surprising. I think it was surprising the way that the international community came together in the beginning of the Trump administration to really put a lot of pressure on North Korea at that time, in spite of the fact that, one might think that because Trump had been so kind of volatile in his policymaking, that others would not have come around to sort of following him in this kind of very kind of risk tolerant approach to relations with North Korea. So, there was a lot of solidarity in the international community. I think I was quite worried about the fire and fury period, obviously, especially given that the national security team at that time, I felt like, wasn't really that experienced, and of course didn't know, frankly, much about North Korea. We had people at obviously the State Department and other agencies around government who had been around this issue, but the top team in the White House had not. And so, it was a bit unnerving. I remember a meeting with the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, and the South Korean foreign minister at that time, Foreign Minister Kang, in his office, where, I think he was trying to basically let her know that the Trump administration was serious about putting a lot of pressure on North Korea, and her being pretty uncomfortable with a lot of the statements and approaches that she was hearing. So it was an uncomfortable time. think I was very surprised by the way the Chinese and the Russians came on board with the sanctions at that time. So,
Hmm.
just kind of a lot of unanticipated moves and volatility and unpredictability.
Hmm. From a personal perspective, I had just started working in journalism in Korea at the time. And from the outside, it felt like that shift from, threats of conflict to it kind of felt almost suddenly to leader diplomacy. It looked incredibly abrupt. Did you feel it was that same way inside the government as well?
Yes, but I think we have to remember back to the first Trump administration. Like, none of us really knew what Trump's foreign policy style was going to be. And this is his foreign policy style now that we've seen it in action for many years since then. It's the buildup of kind of leverage and threats, and then the pivot to diplomacy that we see, we've seen several times now since. So I think at the time it felt like very jarring, but now looking back on it, seems like this is really a Trump style kind of diplomacy.
Hmm. Well, that period, of course, eventually led to the Trump Kim summit process, which was historic in many ways, but ultimately did not produce a lasting agreement. So I want to ask you about what lessons policymakers should draw from that experience. Susan, looking back, what do you think that the US got right in the Trump Kim diplomacy, and what did it get wrong?
Well, I'll have to say that I was certainly not a fan of the Trump way of foreign policy, and I'm still not. But I was a booster of the idea that, we could talk to anyone, and and Trump was certainly willing, and still is clearly willing, to talk to anyone if he thinks he can get some progress on a intractable issue. And there's no kind of political cost that he will pay, which is maybe somewhat unique to him. But he's, even if there was a political cost, I think he's willing to pay it, and he's willing to get out there and explain to people why it's important that he sit down with someone and meet with them. And of course, in the case of North Korea, if you're not talking to Kim Jong Un, you really aren't sure if the picture that you're getting is the one that you need to be getting. So having access to him because Trump was willing to meet with him was, I thought, something that was a great opportunity and that we should try to take advantage of. The downside, of course, to Trump style diplomacy, unfortunately, is that the preparation is not done. And there's a lot of impatience and a lot of kind of ADD type behavior. Like, if we'll do this and we'll throw everything we've got at it, and we'll put a lot of skin in the game, and fly here and fly there, but if it doesn't work within 3 weeks, we're out of there kind of idea. And that is typical, and we see it also, have ever since, basically, in terms of Trump's foreign policy. So I think, unfortunately, they created this opportunity. There was a lot of solidarity in the international community, and then there just wasn't the ability to plan and strategize and have a drawn out kind of negotiation that could have taken advantage of all of that. And they tried. I know Steve Biegun, when he was the special representative for North Korea in advance of that Singapore summit, and then again with Hanoi, tried very hard to meet the North Koreans. He went to Pyongyang, but there just wasn't really time. And a negotiation with the North Koreans takes an incredibly long time because of the history and the deep mistrust. And you've got to go over a lot of old ground, and it's just not going to work if you're trying to do it, with shortcuts.
Hmm. Susan, you had left government by the time of the Hanoi summit, but based on your experience during the earlier phase of that process, what do you think the breakdown revealed about the assumptions that perhaps each side was bringing to the table?
Yeah, I mean, um, probably Trump wasn't um, super well indoctrinated on all the details of what it was that his team was trying to accomplish. And there was infighting, as we know, within his team. And of course, John Bolton was a principal actor at the time. And we know that he's always been, staunchly opposed basically to negotiations with North Korea in any form, and very skeptical of any denuclearization kind of agreements, and was going to be very difficult about any kind of ultimate deal. And then, there was on the North Korean side, the hope that they had gotten from the Singapore summit and the statement that they'd been able to engineer and all of the press around that. They thought they were on the precipice of some kind of monumental change. And I think probably miscommunication was an issue too in that summit. So that sort of both sides were surprised. I think for Trump, he felt like this was just one step in a process, and that he and Kim could get back together again in a future time and take this all up again and try to take the next step. For the North Koreans, it was more, I think, of a make or break kind of event. And maybe the Americans didn't fully appreciate that, or at least certainly Trump didn't. So they did meet one more time, of course, at the DMZ. But after the failure at Hanoi, it seemed like that was kind of, for the North Koreans at least, sort of the end of the prospects.
You've just touched on the planning and preparation, or perhaps the lack thereof, that went into these summits. And I want to ask you a little bit more about that, because one criticism that we've heard during that period is that leader level diplomacy, it moved faster than working level, the working level process underneath it. Susan, would you say that's a fair criticism?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a fair criticism. And I mean, it wasn't for lack of trying, I think. It's just so difficult to get access to the North Korean negotiators. And again, I think the Trump administration was quite forward leaning, at least the people who were responsible for negotiating. And they had a lot of room to run from the Trump administration to try to get things nailed down. It's just that North Korea, again, it takes so long. It's such a difficult and complicated and opaque system. And whether or not the North Koreans are getting instructions that they can actually operate from, nobody's really nobody's really knowing whether or not that's happening. So it's, and all the time there's this kind of self-imposed deadline of a summit meeting coming. So again, it's the North Koreans can sort of stonewall and play for time. And of course, that works to their advantage in this scenario. And the Americans are sort of desperately trying to get things set up and nailed down. And the North Koreans are just, not able to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a bit now about where US policy stands currently, because Washington still officially talks about denuclearization. Of course, North Korea has continued expanding its nuclear and missile capabilities. Kim Jong-un appears more confident than ever in the country's nuclear status. Of course, it's the million-dollar question. Is denuclearization still a realistic policy goal, or has it now become more of a long-term aspiration?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I feel like denuclearization is the goal, but the goal that cannot be stated. So we've seen recently, of course, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping meeting with Donald Trump, and in the communiques afterwards, at least on the U.S. side, mentioning that they have a common position that North Korea must not have a nuclear weapon. Then we see Xi Jinping going to Pyongyang. The communiques coming out of that meeting don't mention denuclearization. I mean, the Russians, the foreign minister in Russia, has said already in the past that denuclearization is kind of a closed issue at this point. So it seems like the major powers realize that even though they they hope that denuclearization can be broached again in the future, and that they understand that it's still a violation of the NPT and a cause for great concern. It's not something they can take up immediately. Now, whether the Trump administration thinks so or not is another question. And they haven't really been too forthcoming about what their approach would be if they would get North Korean diplomacy back on track.
It really, I don't want to oversimplify, but denuclearization really does seem to be the sticking point when it comes to any and all dialogue with North Korea. Is there a way to pursue interim steps with Pyongyang without appearing to accept it as a nuclear weapons state?
I mean, I think we can pursue steps with North Korea. Yeah, I mean, and define it in any way we like. Whether North Korea understands it that way and how they broadcast it to their domestic population and how they make use of it in their own propaganda is another question. And how much tolerance we're going to have for that is going to come into sort of focus as we pursue some other kind of diplomacy with them.
I think it's fair to say a lot has changed in the landscape here on the peninsula since that last round of diplomacy with Trump and Kim, particularly in terms of North Korea's relationships with countries like China and Russia.
Right.
What do you think that Pyongyang would actually want now in exchange for returning to talks?
Yeah, it's the $100,000 question in a way. It used to be that North Korea was quite interested in getting diplomatic recognition, so there was always talk about whether or not U.S. North Korea relations would be so-called normalized, and we would establish liaison offices or even embassies. That does not seem to be such a carrot for them anymore. They, as you say, they've gotten very now close relations with both Russia and China. That's happened, pretty recently, and is a big change from, 6 or 7 years ago when we were last talking about this and having the Trump diplomacy going on. So I think North Korea's sort of wish list has been cut way down. And I don't even think, and as we've seen, even, I don't even think the prospect of sort of meeting with the US president is as much of a, kind of a carrot to hold out as a grand prize for North Korea as it was in the past. I mean, when Trump went to Busan for the APEC meeting last year, apparently, he tried to meet with, or he asked about meeting with Kim Jong-un, and the answer came back as a no, we're not really interested in that at the moment. So, that tells you a lot. And I think, the North Koreans are probably still recalibrating. I think they probably would like to have some kind of relationship with the United States if they could. I mean, they would like to be able to triangulate among Russia, China, the US, and Europe, and anyone else they can find to have some kind of relationship with and gain some benefits from. But it's certainly not the kind of pressing issue that it was, in the past. And so I think that's a real challenge for the US government going forward, is how to engage North Korea and what would North Korea want from that. My own view is that they're probably not going to be very interested until after the Russia-Ukraine war is, comes to some kind of a at least ceasefire, if not conclusion. So until that happens, I think it's going to be very hard to get North Koreans to engage.
Mm-hmm. It definitely seemed like part of Kim's interest in meeting Trump was, as you said, that international recognition and being legitimized on the international stage. But it's so striking to me when we see images, like when Kim went to Beijing not so long ago, of Kim and Putin and Xi Jinping side by side. It almost seems like this is the new stage where he's being legitimized. And I do want to ask you a little bit more about, China and all of this, because you've so much experience working on China and East Asia more broadly. For years, Washington has treated Beijing as almost an essential source to any kind of serious North Korea strategy. But the regional picture, as we've just been discussing, it just looks so different now. How do you think Beijing sees the North Korea problem today?
Yeah, I think, Beijing's policy toward North Korea has really never changed. The one, as I mentioned, big surprise was the extent to which they came on board for sanctions against North Korea in the early first Trump administration. And I've thought a lot about that, because it really went against China's sort of principled foreign policy to lean in so directly on sanctions that affected the kind of humanitarian sort of situation for people on the ground in North Korea, and they had never agreed to that before. And I have to think that was mostly about trying to find a way to deal with the new Trump administration after Trump came in, and everyone was so caught off balance about how to deal with that. But they've spent a lot of time now. Of course, China North Korea relations at that point were extremely poor, and then after COVID and the closure of the border, I mean, if anything, things were worse. Xi Jinping did make several trips, or he made a trip to North Korea after not going there in the sort of run up to the Hanoi and Singapore summits. So they did some restoring of their relationship at that point. But then during COVID, things really went kind of dark. And it's taken a long time for the Chinese to sort of be able to start up exchanges again with North Korea. I guess the flights and the train going across the border, people flows have all just recently restarted. So the Chinese have worked, over years to sort of get back to so-called normal relations now with North Korea. Their premier has just recently now been in Beijing for several days, right after Xi Jinping's visit last month to Pyongyang. So they're really making an effort to repair things. I think the Chinese are, they don't look at North Korea as their policy as a function of kind of anything other than this is a country on our border. We have to keep stability. We have to maintain a relationship with them. We have to have good relations with them, hopefully. And it's a volatile kind of regime. They do things that we don't like. They're kind of problematic for us. But, they're not going anywhere, and we have to deal with it and make sure that we can manage it and handle it. And it's a kind of you know, a resignation, I guess I would say, from Beijing's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the relationship with Russia now that the North Koreans have really doubled down on, and especially in the security and military area, probably gives Beijing some pause. So that's another reason for sort of pushing and stepping up and getting this relationship back into some kind of shape where they can make sure they know what's going on in North Korea and talk to one another.
Let me ask you a little bit more about that improvement we've seen. Russia and North Korea have grown so much closer in the past few years. Do you think that reduces China's leverage over North Korea, or do you think it makes Beijing even more determined to try and get back to the place where it was with North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think it probably made the Chinese a bit uncomfortable and sort of pressed the point that they need to repair this relationship. But it was probably always on the cards that they were going to be moving in this direction anyway. China and Russia don't really provide the same things for North Korea. Russia's really, a kind of I would say it's more of a temporary lift for North Korea. It's probably not a durable long-term thing that North Korea can count on. And it's more in the security side. Russia doesn't have too much that it can provide to North Korea in the way of kind of its economic livelihood. But China is very important, obviously, for North Korea's economy, and that's going to continue to be the case. So, So I think it's both. It's just sort of normal getting back to relations with your neighbor, but also certainly probably driven a little bit by some, looking to the north of the border and a little bit of concern there. I wouldn't
Hmm.
overplay that, but I do think that is a little bit of a factor.
Hmm. We've briefly touched on Xi's visit to Pyongyang. I just want to remind listeners, Xi Jinping visited Pyongyang. It was early June this year. It was his first trip to North Korea in 7 years. He met Kim Jong-un during a summit that both sides framed as a major step forward in China-DPRK ties. Chinese state media said the two leaders reached an important consensus and discussed expanding cooperations in areas like politics, trade, transportation, tourism, culture, border exchanges. North Korea's readout also emphasised political, economic, and cultural cooperation, notably avoided any mention of denuclearization. Given that context, what message do you think that Xi and Kim were trying to send to Washington, to Seoul, and even to Moscow?
Yeah, I mean they've been talking now about this consensus reached at this meeting. That's something that was also prominently featured, of course, after the Trump Xi meeting in Beijing in May. What the consensus is in terms of what each side understood by the consensus is a question, and we don't know the answer really to that. But I assume the consensus is about stability, about some kind of agreement to sort of keep this relationship on a more steady footing than it's been on for the last decade or so, for sure. And what the understanding is about sort of the Kim Jong Un's intentions in terms of the Korean Peninsula, his weapons programs, missiles, etc., testing of nuclear weapons. The Chinese have been adamantly opposed to North Korea's testing of nuclear weapons, and have brought a lot of pressure to bear on the North Koreans about that. We have not seen a nuclear weapons test in many, many years now, probably mostly because of China's unhappiness over the last test. Um, so we don't really know exactly what they have in mind, but certainly the beefed up economic exchanges, beefed up people to people exchanges, cultural exchanges. This is all a part of this idea, I would say, of keeping the relationship on track, steady, not letting it, on again, off again kind of tempo that we've seen recently.
So we have North Korea more confident in its nuclear status, China and Russia playing larger roles, and the US still trying to figure out whether diplomacy is possible. I do want to round out our conversation today by looking at future policy options. Susan, if Washington does decide to make re engagement with North Korea a priority, where do you think that it should begin?
Well, I think it's probably the case that, in the Trump administration, the next 2 years, presumably, there will be a point at which Trump himself gets reanimated by the North Korea problem. You know, we can talk about what should happen, or we can talk about what will likely happen. If North Korean diplomacy gets reanimated in the Trump administration, it will be leader led. It will be probably ill prepared, and it probably will not get us very far, but it may get us another sort of spectacular summit, let's say.
Hmm.
Um, it would be nice if that could be well prepared, coordinated with the South Koreans and other allies in the region, and have some kind of tangible, durable outcome that would be good. Maybe not, wide, CVID type nuclear denuclearization, but some outcome that would be positive and a step on the road toward doing more. Not sure that is what would actually come out of that, but that's what I would hope would be the case. So a sort of step toward more management. If we had a different administration and we were looking at a long-term process to try to really do something about um, the whole complex of problems on the Korean Peninsula, not just the nuclear program, because I really think you can't separate things out like that anymore. Then you would really try to get a kind of a multilateral process, I think, going with other neighbors. I mean, the Chinese, if they're not involved, they're going to be sabotaging. So it doesn't really do any good to leave them out. Um, it's just going to end up in the end sort of undoing whatever progress may have been done. I mean, a real problem at the moment, in my view, is the sort of north south developments and standoff.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't really talked about that, but it's very hard to see how to get the north south diplomacy now going again after the constitutional changes and declarations in North Korea about hostile state, etc. The Trump administration was never a big fan of coordinating first with South Korea on its North Korea diplomacy. So, it's a very tough position for, I think, the South Korean government to be in. They have this phrase of they'll be the pacemaker and Trump can be the peacemaker. I mean, that's a holding pattern for where we are at the moment, and it's fine because nothing is really happening. But we've really got to make sure that we're prepared for some kind of an eventual provocation from North Korea, and at the same time, try to figure out how to get North Korea, South Korea, China, and the US all on the same page when it comes to this. I mean, it'd be nice to include the Russians and the Japanese, but at the moment, it just seems like including Russia is a non starter. So, and I really think, as I said, without the Ukraine war coming to some kind of conclusion, it's really going to be difficult to tackle diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. As you've just touched on, it feels like we're almost at a historic low when it comes to inter-Korean diplomacy. As you said, Lee Jae-myung has called on President Trump to play the peacemaker. He'll play the pacemaker. But how do you think that Washington should coordinate with Seoul, or should it at all?
Oh, it definitely should. I mean, this issue is really an issue of sort of Korean national identity, right? And it's Korea's future. So, I mean, the US should not, just take the issue over and think it knows what's best. I mean, we're not going to know. We're not going to know what's best in that region. And this is something that, frankly, we're not very good at in our foreign policy, listening to people on the ground telling us how it is, right? And if we don't do that, we're going to make mistakes. And we've seen that already. So I hope that we can coordinate closely with our South Korean allies. It's very difficult in South Korea. It's very divided on these issues. Everything's politicized. So it's not easy. That's something that I hope, South Korean society itself can work on, because they really do need to be much more united around whatever the eventual policy is going to be toward North Korea. And it tends to be very fractious. But I think it is an issue of great emotion and national identity in South Korea. So it's understandable that people have strong views. And what we don't want to do is damage the alliance in the process and damage U.S.-South Korean relations. So I think the U.S. needs to take care and husband its friendships at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we wrap up, I do want to take a step back and zoom out from kind of day-to-day policy debate. And Susan, last question I do want to ask you: if you were advising the next US team working on North Korea, what assumption would you tell them to question first?
I think I would tell them that there are real politics in North Korea. It's not just, whatever the leader says goes and he can do whatever he wants. Every country has real politics, whether it's an authoritarian dictatorship or not. And they really need to try to think harder about what is going to be acceptable within that very different North Korean political context.
Well, that was Susan Thornton, retired senior US diplomat and former acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Susan, thank you so much for your time today.
Great to be with you, Alana. Thanks.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Our thanks to Brian Betts and David Choi for helping make this podcast happen. For more reporting, analysis and expert insight on North Korea, visit NK News for the latest stories and NK Pro for deeper analysis, data and research tools. You can also watch this episode on YouTube and be sure to follow us on social media for the latest updates, clips and behind-the-scenes content. I'm Alana Hill. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next time with more on the stories shaping North Korea.